Let me read to you a passage from the 6th chapter of St. Mark's Gospel, verses 1 to 6, for Wednesday of the 4th week in Ordinary Time. St. Mark writes, Jesus left there and went to his hometown, accompanied by his disciples. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue with many, and many who heard him were amazed. Where did this man get these things, they asked. What is this wisdom that has been given to him, that he even does miracles? Is not this the carpenter? Is not this Mary's son, and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. Jesus said to them, only in his hometown, among his relatives, and in his own house, is a prophet without honor. He could not do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. And he was amazed at their lack of faith. That's from Mark chapter 6, verse 1 to 6. It leads us to think of faith. You know, it is not at all unusual for a philosopher in the modern age to be an atheist, or at least an agnostic. Generally, he professes to go on the evidence and never on faith. To go on faith is scarcely rational, he typically believes. For instance, Antony Flew, who lived from 1923 to 2010, was in this respect a representative of his discipline. He belonged to the analytic and evidentialist schools of thought and was notable for his interest in the philosophy of religion. During the course of his philosophically influential life, he was a strong advocate of atheism and argued that one should presuppose atheism until empirical evidence for a God presents itself. There is nothing wrong, of course, with thinking that the fact of God is not self-evident, with the proviso that God may be implicitly known, but Flew's assumption was, of course, that empirical evidence was always and strictly required. Anyway, as is well known, in his old age he famously declared an allegiance to deism, which is to say, an acceptance of the God expounded in Aristotle's writings. This, he was convinced, was what the evidence required, the evidence being the order or design that was manifest in the world. This was indeed the favoured argument of the old deism of the 18th century men such as Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Paine once stated that the only church he accepted as authoritative was the church of his own reason, and the only God which reason taught was the creator of our ordered and designed world. Flew accepted this position, it satisfied his reason, and it kept to the evidence. Of course, there was no room for any supernatural revelation from that supreme designer, nor for any transactions between him and individual human beings. The only impressive arguments for God are the scientific forms of teleology, that is, finality and ends, pointing to an Aristotelian God of power and intelligence. Despite this, there was no afterlife, nor was this God a source of good. After all, look at all the evil in the world. It seems, too, that his new theistic position rested on the origin from DNA of the first reproducing organisms. You cannot account for this on the basis of nature alone. The origin of life, living matter, and the complexity of nature requires a super-intelligence. Mindless matter alone can't do it. From the day Flew declared his conversion right to the end, he was very firm that he was not a Christian. Well, one can only rejoice that Flew got further than his miserable atheism. One must presume that he was sincere and meant well, and he certainly did well in terms of recognition and status in his profession. But he scarcely got far. And what was the reason for this? Doubtlessly there were many reasons, but one was his assumption that reason, understood as strict demonstration from empirical evidence, was the only reasonable form of certitude. This assumption was a powerful faith which he had accepted, and it clouded his intellectual advance thenceforth. What he forgot, or rarely seems to have adverted to, was the pervasive presence and place of faith in ordinary human certitude and understanding. Man is acting on faith continually, and he recognizes this as most reasonable. It is perfectly reasonable to accept the word of persons who are seen to be reliable. But let us not digress here into such a discussion. I mention flu simply as an instance of the prevalent assumption of the modern age. It is that faith is unreasonable, and that the only sure way of being certain of something is to test it by strict logic and empirical evidence. It is important that we be aware of what we tend to assume, and our tendency to despise faith, including religious faith. Of course, religious faith can amount to an unreasonable credulity, but it can be equally unreasonable to be incredulous in the face of the word of the greatest authority. All of this brings us to our gospel today that I read earlier from Mark chapter 6, verse 1 to 6, in which the Son of God incarnate declares himself to be amazed at the lack of faith in him by his own townspeople. Ominously, this lack of faith hampered his freedom to pour on them his blessings. Jesus said to them, only in his own hometown, among his relatives, and in his own house is a prophet without honor. He could not do any miracles there, except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. And he was amazed at their lack of faith. If there is one thing which is evident in each of the four Gospels, and indeed in the rest of the New Testament, it is the nobility of faith, provided, of course, it is faith in the one who is entirely worthy of it. That one is Jesus Christ. For, as St. John writes in his prologue, no one has ever seen God. The only Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has made him known. Christ did not condemn people for a lack of logical skill, but he often condemned them for their lack of faith. There is this to be noticed about the lack of faith too. Our Lord's declarations about it suggest that often the lack of faith is morally culpable. It is often not merely a matter of poor logic or befuddled thinking. It is a moral matter involving moral choices. It can be because one does not want to believe. But let us here simply contemplate our Lord's amazement at the lack of faith, seeing in this the nobility, the grandeur of faith in Jesus Christ. This faith is a gift from on high, which we have been given at our baptism. It is the basis of everything, and it takes us to holiness, to union with Jesus Christ, and to life everlasting in the presence of the Holy Trinity.